Turn your Bibles to Leviticus 27. Derek will be preaching this morning on the whole chapter, but we're just going to read the first 21 verses. Leviticus 27. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving a special dedication to a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value, set the value of a male between the ages of 20 and 60 at 50 shekels of silver, according to the sanctuary shekel. For a female, set her value at 30 shekels. For a person between the ages of 50 and 20, set the value of a male at 20 shekels and of a female at 10 shekels. For a person between 1 month and 5 years, set the value of a male at 5 shekels of silver and that of a female at 3 shekels of silver. For a person 60 years old or more, set the value of a male at 15 shekels and of a female at 10 shekels. If anyone making the vow is too poor to pay the specified amount, the person being dedicated is to present to the priest, who will set the value according to what the one making the vow can afford. If what they vowed is an animal that is acceptable as an offering to the Lord, such an animal given to the Lord becomes holy. They must not exchange it or substitute a good one for a bad one or a bad one for a good one. If they should substitute one animal for another, both it and the substitute become holy. If what they vowed is a ceremonially unclean animal, one that is not acceptable as an offering to the Lord, the animal must be presented to the priest, who will judge its quality as good or bad. Whatever value the priest then sets, that is what it will be. If the owner wishes to redeem the animal, a fifth must be added to its value. If anyone dedicates their house as something holy to the Lord, the priest will judge its quality as good or bad. Whatever value the priest then sets, so it will remain. If the one who dedicates their house wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth to its value, and the house will again become theirs. If anyone dedicates to the Lord part of their family land, its value is to be set according to the amount of seed required for it, 50 shekels of silver to a homer of barley seed. If they dedicate a field during the year of Jubilee, the value that has been set remains. But if they dedicate a field after the Jubilee, the priest will determine the value according to the number of years that remains until the next year of Jubilee, and its set value will be reduced. If the one who dedicates the field wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth of its value, and the field will again become theirs. If, however, they do not redeem the field, or if they have sold it to someone else, it can never be redeemed. When the field is released in the Jubilee, it will become holy, like a field devoted to the Lord. It will become priestly property."
We're going to start today with a thought experiment. Actually, it's a thought and feeling and gut experiment. I'm going to give you two scenarios. What I want you to do is imagine yourselves in those scenarios and notice what are your thoughts, what are your feelings. Scenario number one. You're listening to the radio and you hear this story. Soaring property prices are fueling concerns younger Australians will be shut out of the housing market for good. 28-year-old would-be buyer Azam Farouk says, "The market is insane. We've been trying to buy for a year, but we haven't been able to." Sarah Averbeck from Your Wealth Financial Planning warns that if buyers fail to enter the market in their 20s, they may never be able to. She gives this advice to young Australians. Home ownership is a key to economic security. You don't want to reach retirement age and run out of savings. Take action now to ensure your future is safe. So picture yourself, maybe you're in the car, maybe you're at home, you're listening to that. What are your thoughts right now? What are your feelings right now? Scenario number two, you decide to switch to another radio station, a Christian station, and the host is interviewing the director of a Christian development agency. And he says this: "The Centre for Global Christianity reports that Christians worldwide give less than 2% of their income to church or other Christian causes. And yet 9% of the world's population is living in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 a day. We are committed to ending extreme poverty and helping every child to experience Jesus' promise of life in all its fullness. And we're making an appeal today to all Christians to give generously. What are your thoughts this time? What are your feelings? Maybe as you're listening to scenario number 1, maybe you felt anxious, maybe you felt fearful for the future. Maybe your thought was, I really should commit more of my resources to my future. But then as you listen to number 2, maybe you felt overwhelmed or even guilty. Maybe your thought that time was, I really should give more of my resources to others. Welcome to the complex world in which we live, a world that is constantly making demands of our resources, a world in which we feel pulled in different directions, feel conflicted or confused when it comes to knowing what to do with our resources. How should we think about our time, about our money, about our possessions? How should God's holy, set-apart people think about their resources? Leviticus 27 is going to show us how. Come with me now to the final chapter of this wonderful book. The good news in the book of Leviticus is that God is making a way for people to live in his presence and enjoy his blessing. That's the good news in the book of Leviticus. And what Leviticus does is it portrays, it pictures the ideal worshipper, the true worshipper, as the one who takes hold by faith of that way that God is making. And throughout the semester, we've been seeing what taking hold by faith of that way means. We've been seeing that it means, at the start of the book, it means bringing offerings to God at the tabernacle. We've been seeing that it means being holy as God is holy, ceremonially holy, morally holy. It means observing holy times. It means obeying God's commands. What does it mean for the worshipper's resources? For their time, for their money, for their possessions? Well, Leviticus 27 gives us a glimpse. And it's a glimpse that can liberate us from the anxiety, from the guilt, from the conflicted confusion that we often feel in relation to our resources. So our question today, what do true Israelite worshippers do with their resources? What do true Israelite worshippers do with their resources? We're going to find 3 answers in Leviticus 27, and once we've done that, we're going to consider what it all means for true New Covenant worshippers. Let's dive in. What do true Israelite worshippers do with their resources? The first answer is they pledge their people and animals to God. They pledge their people and their animals to God. This is verses 1 to 13, and these verses are about vows. 1 to 8, vows to dedicate people to God. 9 to 13, vows dedicating animals to God. So a vow was like a conditional promise which you'd make to God, and usually it was made in a crisis situation. Lord, if you save me from this flood, if you save me from this storm, if you save me from this sickness, I vow to give you myself, or I vow to give you my firstborn child, or I vow to give you my very best bull. That's what a vow was. And if what you were vowing was a person, it might have been yourself, it might have been your child, what it meant was that you were promising to give that person to full-time service at the tabernacle. That's what it meant. Like what Hannah did when she was having her fertility crisis. You remember at the beginning of 1 Samuel? This was her vow. Lord Almighty, if only you will look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. So it's that kind of scenario which is envisaged here in these opening verses of chapter 27. Except what Hannah did to fulfill her vow, she deposited the son that God gave her, Samuel, at the tabernacle. What Hannah did was actually the exception. The usual thing to do, the normal thing to do, is what's described in these verses, which was to give an equivalent monetary amount. Have a look from verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value, set the value of a male between the ages of 20 and 60 at 50 shekels of silver." And then verse 4, it says, "For a female, set her value at 30 shekels," and so on, all the way down to verse 7. What you're getting in verses 3 to 7 is the different amounts that need to be given depending on the age of the person who's been dedicated or the gender of the person who's been dedicated. And then in verses 9 to 13 come the rules for vowing animals. So if it's a sacrificial animal, like a bull or a sheep or a goat, the way that you would fulfill the vow would be to bring the animal to the tabernacle, and most likely it would be presented as an offering. But then it says if it's an unclean animal, maybe it's your donkey or your camel, you could either buy it back and the priest would set the value or the amount, or you could just leave it with the priests and they would either use it for tabernacle purposes or sell it and use the money for tabernacle purposes. So that's an overview of this first section, verses 1 to 13. Israelites are pledging their people, they're pledging their animals to God, and these verses are regulating how that's going to be done. Now, I want us to think about what this means, but before I do that, I want to address something which I think you're all thinking about right now. What is the deal with this sexist value setting? 50 shekels for a man, 30 for a woman. And actually, it's not just sexist, it's ageist too. The moment you hit 60, your value drops dramatically, whether you're a man or a woman. So I imagine that some of you are probably feeling offended about this right now. And I want to say to you that this would be offensive if the values set out here were indicating intrinsic value, intrinsic worth of the different categories of people. But they're not. And to read it that way would go right against the grain of the Bible's teaching on human value and human worth. What this is about here is something much more functional, and that is it's about labour value in an agrarian society. So in an agrarian society, the physically strongest group, that is men between 20 and 60, will always fetch the highest price. And that's what these figures here in these verses are tied to, labour value. So please don't read more into these verses than they are intended to bear. These verses are not talking about the value of the different contributions that men or women made to society, or which the young and the old were making to society, and it's certainly not talking about the intrinsic value of those different groups of people, their value before God. In fact, the fact that we react to these verses so strongly, in a way probably that previous generations didn't, might reveal to our shame that we do link labour value to intrinsic value. Okay, let's take a step back now and let's think about what's going on in verses 1 to 13. We've got vows dedicating people and animals to God. Is that even a good thing to do? Don't vows have a bad name in the Bible? Think of Jephthah's story in Judges 11. Jephthah was about to lead Israel into battle, and this is the vow that he made to the Lord. He said, "Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." And then, of course, what was it that came out of the house to meet him? It was his daughter, and she paid the ultimate price for his sin. So don't stories like that one, don't they warn us against this whole practice of dedicating, vowing people to the Lord? Don't they tell us that the whole practice is bad? Well, no, not exactly. Stories like that certainly do warn us against misusing the practice, against sinful or immoral or rash or foolish vows. In fact, more generally, looking at the Old Testament, there's lots of warnings about vow making and about foolish vow making. Ecclesiastes 5, for example, says it's better not to make a vow at all than to make one and then not fulfill it. So yes, there's lots of warnings about misusing the practice or making unwise vows, but these are qualifications to a foundational truth, and that foundational truth is that in the Old Testament, a vow to dedicate a person or an animal to God was part of true worship. And by regulating the practice here, Leviticus 27 is legitimising it, not just legitimising it, making an invitation to Israelites to do it as an expression of true worship. So let's think about this. As Leviticus 27 pictures the way the true Israelite worshippers manage their resources, part of the picture that we're getting is a picture of people ready to pledge themselves, their children, the animals which were their livelihood, to God. What an extreme thing to do. What an extravagant thing to do. What a costly thing to do. The 50 shekels that you'd pay for an adult male is about 4 years' wages. And keep in mind that this is entirely voluntary. There's no command to do it. Anyone who did it because they chose to. What an extravagant thing to do. Maybe right now you're wondering, well, should we be doing this kind of thing? Should we be making vows like this in the New Covenant era? And that's a good question, and I want to get to that in a little bit. But for now, I just want us to pause and notice the kind of relationship that God anticipates having with true worshippers, which is implicit in these verses. It's a dynamic, living relationship. See, in the midst of a crisis, it's anticipated that a worshipper in faith will turn to God for help. And then God, the loving God, the powerful God, will indeed help. And then in turn, the worshipper will respond in thankfulness, going to the tabernacle, fulfilling the vow, giving themselves, giving their child, giving some money or their animal. Just notice what a dynamic, living relationship this is. Notice the ebb and flow in the relationship, which adjusts and matches the actual life situation of the worshipper. The making of that vow in the crisis, it's this tangible expression of dependence of God, of faith in God's power, faith in God's desire to help. And then later on, the fulfilling of the vow, once God has helped, it's this expression of thankfulness. These are the dynamics of the life of faith. We depend, God delivers, we thank God. It's not a static relationship. It's so much more than just assenting to a creed or assenting to some abstract statement about God. It's believing that God's involved in every element of life. It's believing he's active, believing he cares, believing that the same God who performs mighty deeds in salvation history also performs mighty deeds in response to our personal cries for help. How does your relationship with God match up to the picture here? Who do you turn to in a crisis? Your friends, your family, the government, yourself? Who is functionally God for you? Do you believe that no matter what part all those other people might play, that the crisis is ultimately in his hands? And do you believe it so much that you'd be willing to pledge yourself, your child, your livelihood to match that belief? Our question is, what do true Israelite worshippers do with their resources? So the first answer we've just seen is that they pledge their people and their animals to God. Now the second answer, they also pledge their houses and their land to God. So verses 14 and 15 deal with dedicating houses, and then 16 to 25 with dedicating land. And there's a shift in the language in this section. We're no longer talking about vows without conditional promise. God, if you do X, then I will do Y. Now we're talking about dedications. And these are pledges which you would act on immediately, not wait till some condition had been fulfilled. So vows were usually made in a crisis, whereas dedications could be made at any time and usually were made in response to God's goodness and God's blessing as an expression of thankfulness for that. Have a look at verse 14. If anyone dedicates their house as something holy to the Lord, the priest will judge its quality as good or bad. Whatever value the priest then sets, so it will remain. If the one who dedicates their house wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth to its value, and the house will again become theirs. You can see that the mechanism here, the process here, is quite similar to the vowing of animals that we saw before. The priest has to do this valuation, and then if the worshipper wants to keep the house, they can pay that amount, and then they add 20% on top, and then they can have the house, and they've given the money. And in verses 16 to 25, there's something similar going on with land. Again, the priest does a valuation. You can buy it back plus 20%. And there's some variations depending on whether it's ancestral land or whether it's land that you've bought. So again, in this section, we have rules regulating a practice. And what I want us to do is take a step back and just think about this extraordinary practice which is being regulated. And that is worshippers voluntarily giving their houses to God. Worshippers voluntarily giving their land. And remember, land wasn't just the backyard for them, it was the thing which produced their income, giving those to God as an expression of thankful devotion. When I think of expressing gratitude as a gift, I'm usually thinking in terms of a bottle of wine or a box of chocolates, or maybe if it's a really big thank you, Alan Thompson's Colossians commentary. But this is off the scale, right? It's off the scale. A house, land. I need a whole new category when I'm thinking of thank you gifts if I'm going to get my head around this. But this is the picture that we have here of true worship. This is the living relationship that these verses anticipate. Extraordinary gifts to express extraordinary thankfulness to an extraordinarily generous and gracious God. So again, I want to ask you, how does your relationship with God match up to the picture here? What do you do when you find yourself blessed? Who do you attribute it to? You and your own hard work? People around you? Luck? And if you do recognise that God is the source of that blessing, does it well up into extraordinary thankfulness, house and land type level thankfulness? What do true Israelite worshippers do with their resources? First, they pledge their people and animals to God. Second, they pledge their houses and land to God. And now, finally, third, they pledge without skimping. They pledge without skimping. What the final section does, and this is verses 26 to 33, is it deals with things that you can't pledge to God. Why can't you pledge them to God? Because they're already His. Have a look. There's three things that are highlighted here that you can't dedicate to God. Verses 26 to 27 is firstborn animals. I'll read verse 26. It says, "No one, however, may dedicate the firstborn of an animal, since the firstborn already belongs to God, whether an ox or a sheep. It is the Lord's." Then you've got verses 28 and 29, you've got devoted things. So people or things could be devoted to the Lord. Usually it would be God himself or a leader who would declare it devoted, like what God did when Israel entered Canaan. The Canaanites and their possessions were all devoted to the Lord. So devoted things are another category of thing that you can't dedicate to God because they're already God's. And the last category is tithes in verses 30 to 33. Again, This is something that already belonged to God, a tenth of your crop, a tenth of your flock, a tenth of your herd, so you couldn't go and dedicate them again. Just think about the picture that we're getting of human nature, of sinful nature here in these verses. It's pretty devastating, isn't it? Imagine that it's your birthday party and your friend turns up and says, "You are going to love the gift that I've got you." And he makes a really big deal of calling everyone at the party to say, "Come out and see the gift that I've got." And he pulls you out onto the street and everyone's there. And when you get there, you look and it's your car, which you lent him yesterday, wrapped in a ribbon. How are you feeling towards your friend right now? See, up until this point in Leviticus 27, the portrait of the true Israelite worshipper has been so positive, so idealised, but now there's a balancing dose of realism. There will be some who want the credit that comes with being seen to make extravagantly generous pledges to God, but who don't actually want to be generous to God. Like Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5, remember? Who said that they'd given all the money from the sale of the land which they'd consecrated to God, but actually they were holding back some of it for themselves. It's a really unattractive picture, isn't it? People who want to be known by others as voluntarily making generous pledges, but secretly they're finding a way to hold on to it, to grasp onto it for themselves. It's really unattractive. But I know that even though I find it unattractive, I know that the potential for that sin is in my heart, and I know that it's in yours too. Even when the Israelite calculates the tithe, there's the potential there for skimping as well. It comes out in verses 32 and 33. Have a look. Verse 32. Here's the method for tithing your animals. It says, "Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod, will be holy to the Lord." So what you have to do here is you have to line up your animals and then you count them off. And number 10 goes to God, number 20 goes to God, number 30 goes to God. But what if you're counting them off and you realise that number 20 is your fattest sheep, and then limping up behind number 21 is this sheep with a lame leg? Can you make a quick switch? Well, that's what verse 33 is about. Verse 33, "No one may pick out the good from the bad or make any substitution. If anyone does make a substitution, both the animal and its substitute become holy, and you cannot be redeemed." It's kind of like when I get a toy the kids are fighting over and just take it away and no one can have it. No skimping. That's the point here, no skimping. In fact, there was a similar rule back in verse 10, which we skipped over at the time. This is back when it was talking about how to make vowing animals to God and what to do there. Verse 10 says, you can't substitute a bad one for a good one. So in the heat of the crisis, you had said, "God, I will give you my very best goat." And then now that God's helped, the crisis is averted and you start regretting that. What if I just do a little switch here? Verse 10 says no. Old Testament commentator J. Sklar writes this. He says, "It is a human tendency to promise God much when we need him, but to thank him little when he meets our needs. Isn't it just?" So when it comes to pledging our resources to God, the message here is no backtracking, no skimping. So that is Leviticus 27's picture of what true Israelite worshippers do with their resources. They pledge their people and animals to God. They pledge their houses and land to God, and they pledge without skimping. What does this mean for us new covenant worshippers? Should we vow our resources to God in the midst of our crises? In Southeast Asia, I taught at a missionary training college, and I would often ask the new missionary candidates when they arrived at the start of the course, "Why are you becoming a missionary?" And once when I asked that question of a young student called Ridwan, he said, "Because I made a vow." And I said, "Tell me about that." And he said, "I was sick. I was sick to the point of death. The doctors had all said there was nothing they could do. And I said to God, God, if you heal me, I will become a missionary. And he did heal me, and so here I am. And I've got to admit, at the time, I didn't quite know what to make of Ridwan and his backstory. Is this something that we should be doing, we New Covenant worshippers, vowing our resources, vowing ourselves to God in the midst of a crisis? Well, you won't find anything in the New Testament to say that we shouldn't. In fact, if you read the book of Acts, you'll find examples, chapter 18, chapter 21, of Christians doing just that, making vows to God, just like Old Covenant believers had done. It seems these voluntary vows might still form a part of the life of true worship. Now, certainly we should think very carefully before making one. No rash vows or foolish vows or sinful or immoral vows. And certainly we shouldn't use vows to get out of other responsibilities. Jesus warned the Pharisees about doing that. But making a voluntary vow can be an expression of true worship today. And if we do make such a vow, today's passage is warning us, is telling us, no backtracking, no skimping, no switching in of the dodgy sheep. If you make a promise to God, keep it. Just as Ridwan is keeping his. To this day, he's still serving as a missionary in a very hard place where there's no electricity and no running water. He is keeping the vow he made to God, the God who saved him. So if you make a promise to God, keep it. But beyond that specific matter of a crisis-provoked vow, there's a picture here in Leviticus 27 which I want us to see, I want us to soak it up, and I want us to apply it to our whole lives. It's a picture of radical, open-hearted generosity towards God with our resources. It's a picture of spontaneous, voluntary, extravagant gifts. It's a picture of dependence on God and thankfulness to God, which is so profound that it leads to the giving of houses and of land and of animals and even of people to God. This is what the life of true worship looks like when it comes to our resources. This is what a life transformed by the gospel, a life transformed by God's grace to us already in Jesus. It's what it looks like. Extraordinary generosity in response to an extraordinary salvation. In my last 2 ministry roles, I've had the privilege of seeing this kind of thing in action. In our role as missionaries, our life and our ministry was 100% donor funded. And our agency, OMF, used to give us regular statements, regular reports with the names and the amounts of the donors. And I can say that looking through that list was a profoundly spiritually challenging and profoundly spiritually edifying experience. I can still remember looking through those lists and seeing particular names and the amounts next to it and thinking, oh my goodness, that person isn't even that wealthy. And yet there's this open-hearted generosity to God. And now in my role as principal here, from time to time, Greg Swanton will come and tell me about a particular donation that's been made. And once again, I'm blown away. I think, wow, God's people responding to God's grace with open-hearted generosity. Just as God's people pledging their resources back then resourced God's work at the tabernacle, so too today, God's people pledging their resources to God is resourcing God's kingdom work in the world. It's the way it's happening. Do you know what this is? This is the Africa Bible Commentary. It's a book that equips readers to understand and apply the word in the African context. It's a book which has had a profound impact in Africa and beyond. Do you know what this is? This is a book on biblical theology in the local language where I used to teach at a Bible college and which I used to give to my students in my Old Testament class to read. Do you know why these two books and many others like them exist? Let me tell you their story if you haven't heard it. John Stott was a pastor and a writer who had a burden to equip pastors in under-resourced parts of the world. Now, John Stott had written a lot of books. He was entitled to royalties for over 60 publishing projects of his. Now, I can tell you that from personal experience that publishing Christian books doesn't normally make you rich from royalties. But if you're John Stott, it's actually quite different. If you've written some of the biggest selling Christian books of the century, like he did, Basic Christianity, The Cross of Christ, and so on, it is a different story. And so his royalties were worth multi-millions of dollars. He irrevocably assigned all of his royalty earnings to a trust to fund the resourcing of pastors in Africa, Asia, and South America, which led to the founding of Langham Partnership. This was an extravagant pledging of his resources to God, which even now that John Stott has gone to be with the Lord, it continues to have a global gospel impact through Langham trainings, which I used to attend sometimes in Southeast Asia, and Langham resources like those 2 books I just showed you. Just think about John Stott. John Stott, who didn't believe he was entitled to these things. He wasn't driven by financial anxiety or fear about his own future. He wasn't grasping for himself, accumulating for himself. He was actually famous for living very simply. The people that knew him well just kept wanting him to buy a new jacket to replace the blue threadbare one he always wore. He was freed up by the gospel to give to God. Extraordinary generosity in response to an extraordinary salvation. How about you? How about me? How about the next time we hear a story on the radio about the property market? Leviticus 27 invites us, it frees us to have a mindset of extraordinary generosity to an extraordinary God. And it's on this note that Leviticus finishes. That's the end of the book. And as Kristen said at the start, a lot of people think it's a pretty strange way to end with regulations about vows and dedications. Some people think that the rhetorical flourish that you get in 26 with blessings and curses would have been a much better way. This seems like an anticlimax, but I think we've seen today that this is a perfect place to finish. In fact, the book is finishing where it started. Can you remember back to week 1, Leviticus chapter 1? The burnt offerings, those voluntary gifts, costly gifts given to express thankful devotion, given over to God as holy. Do you remember that? Well, that's where we're finishing today, isn't it? In chapter 27, the last chapter, voluntary gifts, costly gifts to express thankful devotion, given over to God as holy. In fact, it's been what this whole book has been about, hasn't it? When the holy God graciously comes to live with us, we are called to become holy, to be holy like he is holy. And that means being completely set apart for him. It means consecrating everything we have to him, our houses, our land, our animals, our children, our very selves.